looked at how do we get these different communities to develop. What is this sense of Pan-Africanism as a political movement that then says, regardless of where you are, what can you do to create that sense of what it means to be an African? How do we look at the institutions, the structure of the African continent itself, and say, how do we relate to them? How do we bring them into play? How do we ensure that they are responsive to these diaspora communities wherever we exist within the world? And so, where there has been various interactions, I know I myself have served as a technical advisor to the African Union in various situations. You know, it really is a process of observation. There's ECOSOC, the Economic Council, community, social organizations, and there's been struggle to ensure that there's adequate representation of the diaspora within these organs of the African Union and these other councils of state, such as the Pan-African Parliament. And so, although there's been recognition now of the African Union, that there should be a sixth region, because the continent of Africa is now developed into 5 regions, has been developed into 5 regions, and those are the geographical areas of the continent. But the African Union has now said the 6th region should be recognized as a diaspora. And whereas the other 5 regions have specific representation, the 6th region does not. And so that's why I said there's this question of observation. We can contribute, but we actually don't have a representation. So there is a call for the African diaspora to have full participation in all the structures of the African Union. There's a call for the African diaspora to be recognized by individual nation states in terms of their contributions, not just in terms of their own citizenry, but all of the diaspora. And so we have had different states, specifically Senegal and Ghana, who've made efforts to speak more broadly to the contributions of the diaspora and to include the diaspora in this process. And so, what is it that we hope to accomplish? If the diaspora, meaning all the people of African descent who live around the world, not just in the West, but also in the Middle East and the East, if all these diaspora communities were brought together, what could we contribute and what would it look like? We think it would strengthen the African presence worldwide. We think that if in fact the African Union were a living, breathing presence in Canada, there would have been a more deliberate and a more vocal response to what I would say is the assassination of the 6 warrior brothers in Quebec. I think that there would be a consistent message that goes out in terms of what happens and why. And there would be that message that was speaking at both the economic and political and cultural and social levels. But that presence, that sense, is not just about the African Union as an institution on the continent, but what you as a community feel to be your responsibility as part of that body. So if in fact you do feel that responsibility, we think that through this network, there are skills and abilities in all these diaspora communities. There's skills and abilities here in British Columbia that could play a role in the continent. The International Decade for People of African Descent says that one of the first things we have to do is education. Certainly forums like this provide a context for that kind of process. But also, what is it that each and every one of you can do to take this message further, not just for February, but throughout the year? When we look at what Canada is doing, is it possible to establish an African lobby that says a particular measure is or is not in the interest of African people? Certainly, this is coming up very clearly in the United States right now with this new situation that we have. And I'm going to leave that at that. But certainly, there should also be an understanding in these diaspora communities about what is it that the African Union is trying to do. And there should be a sense of accountability within the African Union from the diaspora communities worldwide. So people actually say, if in fact we've committed to this Agenda 2063, what have you as the AU actually done to ensure that there's dissemination about information, there's a provision of support, et cetera, et cetera. And so the sense of accountability goes both ways. Certainly there should be resource mobilization. And there's a lot of discussion, and I don't have time now, but there's a very there's an intense discussion around this question of remittances. And the fact that Kenya, for instance, for Kenya, remittances is the #1 source of foreign exchange for the country. And it's like number 2 or 3 in Nigeria. And you can go across the continent and see it elsewhere. Do people understand when I say remittances? Okay. That's the money that I send home. And it's very interesting because I've been, traveling for a while. And early, when we would go to the continent, then the word would go out, Julia Lynn's going somewhere. And then people from that somewhere would come to the door and say, oh, you're going this place? Would you please take this money from my sister? Would you please take this money from my brother? Would you please take this money? And don't even worry, someone will come to you. Just tell me where you are, and someone will come to you and get it. People know, they're laughing, but they know, okay? Well, that was an informal transfer of funds. But as the world changed, and we got Western Union, and for Kenya, we got M-Pesa, so we've got different ways of transferring money. Now people are transferring money through a formal mechanism. And so now the governments are able to count it. Before, all they knew was a particular community now had a new school. Because many of these communities would send back remittances specifically for community development projects, specifically for some kind of social improvement in their community. So a counselor may look around and say, oh, over there they have a new school, or over there they have a new clinic, and not know exactly how that happened. All right? But now the government is able to track that money, and now, of course, what do they want to do? They want to tax it. Of course, they want to tax it. All right? So and for many people, they're saying that it's really this financial issue around remittances that is driving the discussion of the contemporary diaspora as opposed to the political analysis that drives the historic diaspora. But certainly, fundraising and resource mobilization is important. But also just resource support, among others. Because we have, for instance, Freedom, one of the things is that within what we call this, the International Civil Servant class. Let me just stop waffling. There's an International Civil Service class. And these are people who staff all these organizations worldwide that function, like through the United Nations or through these international NGOs. All right? And Ethiopians staff those organizations more than any other community in the world. Meaning there are more Ethiopians serving within the United Nations, we're serving within these international NGOs, et cetera, than any other group. And you think, and you have to think about why and where, and we forget that Ethiopia is like has the second or third largest population on the continent. And because of their particular situation, it was a highly educated group of people. And so they were able to move into many of these slots in a way that's become particularly effective. And so we say, rather than seeing that as simply a figure, how do we actually actualize that in our interest? If we know particular people are somewhere, what is the information that can be shared? What are the networks that can be built? How do we actually, ensure that certain information only comes out, but goes to the right place, and then comes someplace else? And how do we ensure that at the end of the day, that functions in our interest? And so the question of the diaspora, as I said before, is incredibly multi-layered. In terms of the International Decade for People of African Descent, we're now saying that that is a 10-year period, It's a 10-year period in which we should look at questions around recognition. That is, how do we promote knowledge of, information about people of African descent? It's about justice, and how do we adopt and share both national and communal concepts of justice. And very often, let me just add that the third one was about development in terms of ensuring, again, both political and social growth within a particular community. But I want to stop just for a moment and just reflect briefly on this question of justice. Because very often, and again, one of the things that I really just want to hope that I convey to people that there was a vibrant, thriving society in every part of Africa before colonialism began. And so there were systems of society that existed, and those systems continue to reflect in various ways and different kinds of concepts. And I know that for Kibeti and some of the others of us, not the young ones so much, but some of the, little gray bears there, we may remember growing up. And when we did something in the community, I know if I, went someplace, then anyone in the community had the right to say, Julia Lynn, that's not right. Anyone in the community had the responsibility to say, Julia Lynn, what are you doing? And why are you doing it? Because the community as a whole had the responsibility to ensure that if there was any source of discord with any particular individual, that had to be addressed for the interest of the community as a whole. And so in terms of jurisprudence, there are issues between group rights and individual rights. And in many traditional societies, it was about group rights, and it was about the health of the community. Peter said something earlier about Kiswahili. In many African languages, when people greet, it's not just about how I am, but it's how, my mother and my father and the community, and until you address everyone, you couldn't move on. And it really isn't about how you are, but how is the health of the community. And so when we talk about, bringing new models to bear, one of the experiences that I had working in South Africa is there's an equality court in South Africa. And this was created as a separate tool when the democracy was obtained in 1994. And so after the first democratic elections in 1994, these courts were established outside of the regular criminal and civil courts simply to address the experiences that people had under apartheid. And the courts were such that they have 13 to 17 remedies. And in civil society, you can go in and you can get money, or you can get you get damages. You're made whole in some kind of way. In criminal court, you can go to jail, or you're fined. But under these courts, these special courts that said, given our particular history, how do we make the community whole? I could go in and file a suit against someone and say, all I want is an apology. Because as an individual and as a family, as a community, we will be made whole by an apology. And so I want you to think about how we can bring some of these concepts to bear in our communities today, and not look at them as archaic forms of justice, not look at them as something that is a historical relic, but actually say that given, what I like to say is the dis-ease that exists among all of our communities, how can we creatively look around the world to see what can help to make us whole? And certainly I think within African jurisprudence, there are some resources. I am skipping, of course, but I want to just share with you a quote